Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the latest Green Recovery Dialogue, which OECD, WWF, EDF, and the World Bank have collaborated to bring to you. My name is João Campari. I lead the global food practice in WWF. And today we will be discussing how recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic can help in the redesign of the global food system, ensuring that we have healthy people in a healthy planet. Right now, the food system is not working well for people or the planet. This is nothing new. For years, it has been the cause of nature loss and deforestation and around a quarter of all greenhouse gas emissions. While this happens, 820 million people go home hungry every day, with nearly 2 billion either obese or overweight. And what is most impressive to me actually is that 1/3 of all food produced is never eaten. The pandemic has not only highlighted these challenges, but brought other issues into play. Trade disruptions caused by restrictions of movements and insular policies have shown just how fragile our food system is, especially in rural and developing areas. In Africa, for instance, it imports $5 to $15 billion more of agricultural products than it exports, and trades about $8 billion in food and agricultural products regionally. Disruptions to this trade has increased food insecurity in the region. Since February, 12 million additional people have been pushed into acute food insecurity in sub-Saharan Africa. And by the end of the year, there could be 130 million more people globally pushed into that condition. As we act to restart our economies and safeguard livelihoods, we must ensure that food system recovers sustainably with the ability to deliver healthy and nutritious diets for all. Next year, the UN will host the Food Systems Summit. That will be a flagship moment in the redesign of the food system. But the recovery cannot wait until September 2021 to start. Without urgent action on the food system right now, we will struggle to achieve any of the SDGs by 2030. I mentioned the issues of malnutrition already, but our food affects our health beyond nourishment. Eating unsustainably produced food from land or sea will also mean we have less clean water and clean air. Our health will suffer dramatically if we don't put in place a sustainable recovery path. Key to this is halting deforestation and conversion of natural systems for agriculture, which according to a recent WWF report is one of the primary causes of the emergence of infectious diseases like COVID-19. It is also a driver of biodiversity loss and climate change. So we need to work with businesses to ensure that food supply chains are deforestation and conversion free. Ceasing to expand the amount of land we use to produce food will mean also to have to use existing farmland more sustainably. Alongside agroecological approaches and nature-based solutions, we need to rehabilitate a large share of the 2 billion hectares of degraded and degrading lands that are out there. This is the size of South America approximately. And a lot of this land is farmland, which is underperforming or disused. We are posed with the challenge of making soil rehabilitation and land restoration attractive to investors and demonstrating that sustainable interventions can be bankable. I am delighted today that WWF is partnering with OECD, EDF, and the World Bank to host this conversation with sectors that shape the enabling conditions for a different food system to emerge, deliver solution, and catalyze action. Over the next hour, we will discuss with these different sectors the various levers for change and policies that can lead to improvements in human health and to a resilient food system. We are very lucky to be joined by a wonderful panel of speakers. I'd like to welcome and introduce each one of them. Agnes Kalibata. Agnes is the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy for the 2021 Food Systems Summit, and she's also the president of AGRA. Francesco Branca is the director of the Department of Nutrition for Health and Development with the World Health Organization. Diane is the head of the Agro-food Trade and Markets Division at OECD. Suzanne Gaboury, she is the Chief Investment Officer at FinDev Canada, and Diane Holdorf, who is Managing Director of Food and Nature at WBCSD. Thank you all for joining the session. Before we start, for those of you watching, please use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen to post your questions to the speakers. You can post questions throughout the webinar, and we will try to answer them as many as we can, either during the session or at the end. Now, though, I'd like to kick things off by asking a warm-up question actually to our panel. And the question is, from your point of view, the point of view of your organization, your sector, what two things have the most significantly impacted the performance of the global food system under COVID-19? Let me start with Agnes. Give us your view, Agnes, about the two things that most impacted your sector and where you stand.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me and organizing this meeting with such wonderful panelists. I've been privileged over the last few months to work with the Food Systems Summit. So when you say what you're saying, it's all pressure on my shoulders. But to go back to the question that you just asked, the two things that I see that have impacted our global food systems, starting here in Africa, is the combination of lockdowns and disruption of supply chains. For me, when this happened, my first reaction from a person who is working on zero hunger here, if you might say the work we are doing in food security as working on zero hunger, my first reaction was like, oh my God, this is going to cause a food crisis. I definitely understood the health danger, but my immediate concern was knowing that we have very limited safety nets here on the African continent. My biggest worry was that this would cause a food crisis because people will not think about the fact that there's a need to go to the field and continue farming. The rainy seasons were coming on. We're lucky this year has been great in terms of seasons. So we started looking around, and I particularly looked around and came up with this information from India, where India was treating the agricultural sector and the food sector in general as an essential sector. And that's basically what I needed. So I even wrote a piece on this, but also started really encouraging countries that we cannot lock down the agricultural sector. And this, not just because of me, but of course, because of all the efforts all of us are putting in, this really is working for us in the sense that the agricultural sector in many places has been treated as an important good. The next bit then is when you look at what is happening in a country like Fiji. I was talking to again, given my role as special envoy, I was talking to the people of Fiji the other day. Countries that are solely dependent on markets and on other countries to supply food, the disruption of supply chains has been huge. So nobody, while there hasn't been embargoes on food or export bans, the fact that the demand for shipment has gone down, the fact that the rules around how ships move has tightened, means that actually food becomes more expensive for some of these countries. And we are seeing this even at local level, where closure of markets, closure of supermarkets across the world have completely disrupted supply chains. Here in Africa, though, one thing that has really been a disruptor has been, in a bad way, of course, has been the disruption of SMEs. African agricultural sector is mostly driven by the SME sector. The SME sector has grown by 800% in the last 30 years alone. It moves 65% of the food that is eaten off farm, and it is responsible for 90% of how the agricultural sector functions. Now, without access to inputs, without, to cash flows, to appropriate cash flows, there's been a lot of loss of jobs in the SME sector. There's been a lot of disruption in this sector. And I'm even worried that over 50% of these businesses will close. And to revive them, to get them back to business is going to be a challenge. So overall, three things have happened. This has impacted jobs big time. We've had a lot of job loss. This has impacted food, how people access food and nutritional security overall. And this is contributing in general to food, to more expensive food. So I would say those are the two critical things I see around here.
Thank you so much, Agnes. You raised important food for our thinking for the rest of this webinar. So thank you so much for your contributions. Francesco, Agnes mentioned about lockdowns and the supply chains. From your perspective, from the WHO and the nutrition, the department that you lead, what are the two things that you mostly that have mostly significantly impacted in your impression, in your view?
Yeah, João, first of all, thank you very much for inviting WHO to speak in this on this very important topic. Indeed, food systems and human health are so closely linked. And COVID-19 has exposed the fragility of our current food systems. The stay-at-home, the introducing social distancing adopted by most countries have contributed to simultaneous multiple shocks throughout the food system, from the food production, processing, transport, trade, and retail. And so both the production and the consumption patterns have been affected. But really, I would like to give you three messages today. The first one is that we were already in trouble before the pandemic struck. In the world, nearly 1 in 3 people suffer from at least one form of malnutrition. We still have 144 million children under 5 who are stunted, 47 million who are wasted, 38 million children under 5 who are overweight, and about 700 million obese people. Plus, the unhealthy diet, consumption of unhealthy diet is responsible for about 10 million deaths every year. And then, if you look at food safety, about 1 in 10 people in the world is falling ill every day after contaminating food, and 420,000 die. So this is basically not a food system that is capable to address our health, let alone being resilient. Second, what are the connections between food system and health? And there are multiple channels there. I mean, first of all, the occupational hazards. People get sick because they work under unhealthy conditions. And that's what we've seen in this COVID pandemic, even more. If you look at the outbreaks of COVID in the meat processing industry. Environmental contamination. People get sick because of contaminants in the water, soil, or air. Third is contaminated, unsafe, and altered foods. Fourth is the unhealthy dietary patterns. And fifth is food insecurity. People get sick because they can't access adequate, acceptable food at all times. So really this interaction spans across many areas. And my third point is that, yeah, COVID-19 has been making basically even this worse, showing that the system wasn't resilient enough. But at the same time, it's opening a window of opportunity. We haven't been listening to previous warning signs. I mean, we had the Ebola crisis that also had an impact on the food system, but locally in Africa. And I remember when we were negotiating the ICN2 declaration during the Ebola crisis, we actually included a paragraph saying, we recognize that the root causes of and factors leading to malnutrition are complex and multidimensional, and that epidemics such as of the Ebola virus disease pose tremendous challenges to food security and nutrition. But then we didn't act. We didn't act in a coordinated and global way to invest in our food system and make them more capable of ensuring healthy and safe diets for all. And we continued business as usual. That was a big mistake.
Francesco, thank you so much, especially for highlighting that, the world, actually, societies have been tone deaf into the warning signs. The problems are not new. And I agree with you that COVID-19 and the pandemic that arose from that only highlighted the fragility of the system that you and then Agnes described. Agnes brought some issues of trade, which you did too, how it impacts health, human health, and food insecurity. So the trade disruptions that we have seen with COVID is even highlighted even more the fragility of the system. So Diane works with the OECD. From your point of view, what are the two things that COVID-19 is teaching us for the sector you represent, trade, and so on, linked to nutrition and trade, please?
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be here among all these fascinating speakers covering this topic, which is so important for the world. So from my perspective, actually, or from the perspective of the OECD, we saw a lot of disruptions and immediate disruptions in terms of input bottlenecks and problems with seasonal labor for harvesting, labor shortages and shutdowns, transport disruptions. And I don't want to discount the disruptions, but actually we also noticed that there was evidence that firms were adapting. So they changed the way they were operating. What could have turned into a food crisis immediately was in many instances forestalled. And also policymakers adapted what they were doing to try to address bottlenecks. So for me, I have sort of a good side and a bad side around the implications for food systems from the COVID. I think one of the things that has been particularly challenging is all the measures related to health, which are essential, can have ripple effects throughout the whole food system and food chain. And other speakers have already mentioned this. So you could have implications for production of seed, and then planting, and then harvesting, and then processing, and then the transport. So there can be a sort of cascade effect. And now that we're entering another phase, it feels like, or the continuation of the phase, I think we need to keep an eye on what happens with these kinds of health measures to make sure that the policy responses are appropriate and addressing the right bottlenecks to make sure that food can move to the people who need it. So that's sort of my, that's the challenge, the side that I see as a challenge. But I would like to say that at the first instance when this pandemic, when it became clear that this was going to have a global impact, I think many people working in the area of global food security immediately thought of the food price crisis in 2007 and 2008, where we saw, due to some production shocks and then policy responses related to trade, so export restrictions, we saw really dramatic prices for staple foods, particularly rice. And there was a lot of concern given this extreme moment around COVID and being in a situation that no one had ever experienced before, that policymakers would resort to those kinds of measures, which can have massive spillover effects on food security globally due to the trade effects and the effects on prices, which we saw in 2007, 2008. But the good news is that through the experience more than a decade ago, some coordination mechanisms had been put in place around monitoring these kinds of market disruptions. There's a group called the Agricultural Market Information System that monitors markets for some major food crops, and they kind of launched into a higher level of monitoring, and policymakers responded in a sense by coordinating some of their message around avoiding some of these very trade disrupting measures, so that some members of the WTO put forward an agreement in that area. Parts of the G20 agricultural ministers also said that they plan to avoid export restrictions. And through this coordination, we, I think, avoided what could have turned into a pretty dramatic price episode. We saw some export restrictions being put in place in the beginning, but most of them were time limited, and they have most of them been removed. So we had limited disruption. So my message is, there are disruptions happening, but also there's evidence that we've learned, in a sense, from past experiences on how to better handle these kinds of disruptions that can cascade through international markets. Thanks.
Thanks, Diane. So the system is adapting itself. It's like a very good. We've heard now from the trade perspective, from the global policy perspective, and the nutrition perspective. Now I'd like to move into the financial sector. Suzanne, what are the two things that significantly impacted, from where you stand, the global food system under COVID-19?
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here and speaking on this important topic. Yeah, you know, some of the initial shocks that are being felt along the supply chains, the value chains within the food sector. The first thing, you know, with regards to finance, people are looking at, you know, what kind of impact it is that they're experiencing with their existing clients. This has meant a halt in the availability of finance, as people needed to evaluate, you know, what their situation was, what their portfolios were. And so as a consequence, you know, everyone understands that the food systems are a primary area, which are a strategic sector, I believe. I think there's a recognition of that. And so how do you help with those types of situations? You know, looking at working capital solutions, looking at trade finance in order to support the local economies and the farmers in those regions. We know that the farmers, the agricultural sector, I should say, is one of the largest employers globally. I think Agnes had mentioned about that, the huge impact that has within all the global systems. So how do you address that? I think you need to provide local solutions to the banks that are there. You know, the agricultural space has always been considered the riskier space, and it is, you know, from many perspectives. But I think that you need to have some solutions that you're looking at with regards to addressing risk. And so, you know, some of the biggest things that we've seen is the changes within the finance space that are needed, focusing on, you know, providing finance to trade finance, to keep those trade lines open, to keep those food supplies open. And I think that Leanne had also mentioned about the flexibility within the system. You've seen a huge flex and a pivoting of many of the companies in the within the supply chain in order to face their new realities. So within the finance space, there's new ways of looking at that. Okay, how do we quantify risk? Are we comfortable with that? I think everyone realizes that you may have to get comfortable with a bit more risk than you were before, that you need to find ways of providing finance to those on the ground that are providing the finance or the agricultural inputs and supplies that you need. And through that, then you need more coordination, I believe, amongst the international bodies, amongst financiers generally. So there's multifaceted, I think we've all said that, there's multifaceted impacts, but I think that that requires a bit more coordination and better solutions from the finance community.
Thanks a lot, Suzanne. I will get back in the second round of questions to you about a particular role of and risk of the SMEs. Agnes mentioned that and how important that is to the global community, especially in the in developing countries. So let's pick that what it means for your sector around SMEs in the second round of questions. So thank you very much. And this is a perfect time to move into Diane Holdorf. Diane, what are the two things that businesses are paying attention to as and on the impacts of COVID-19, please? Over to you.
Thanks so much, João. And it's been really great to hear from this amazing group of panelists that you've put together. I'll try to pull some of these themes through while really do what business is seeing and how business is, in fact, responding to this crisis. As has already been said, COVID put a very sharp focus on where the food system was most fragile. Of course, we've already been working towards a transformation of the food system, but some of these very specific disruptions that COVID identified included areas of systemic challenge across the value chain, by geography, and by commodity. We've seen in particular real concerns increasing around nutrition security, and this is something Francesco spoke to so well. We saw concerns around food prices, which Leanne, of course, spoke to. We didn't actually struggle with increased food costs, but what companies are struggling to respond to is actually the issues that have been highlighted on social inequity because of the tremendous income loss that so many families across the globe, frankly, have been struggling with due to job losses related to the COVID crisis. That has created a big challenge around changing consumption patterns, both sufficiency as well as access, as well as changes for how people do get their food. We've seen this massive change from out-of-home eating to retail and online food purchases, which completely changes supply chain setup and structure, which has in turn led to tremendous losses and exacerbated in many locations further income loss and issues of hunger. Specific disruptions to this access to market, particularly for smallholders. Many farmers generally, but particularly for smallholders, has been very challenging. And this issue of ongoing cash flow in particular, as a build on the finance challenges that Suzanne spoke to, have really been highlighted. And then specifically in crops such as perishables, you know, fruits and vegetables, access to market, much less global distribution network consistency has been a real challenge. And, you know, Suzanne has already spoken on the challenges around rice and some of these commodities. So transportation and logistics disruptions were a huge issue in the beginning, but as we see COVID continue to cycle and cases rise in different locations, business is really expecting that to continue to be a challenge. So as we've worked with our members, we've looked at over 150 companies and how they've responded to this crisis that COVID has presented. And what some of us have already spoken to, I want to just bring an even finer point to. COVID has highlighted the social inequity across all supply chains, but particularly in the food system. And so the businesses who've responded the best have been addressing the issues of social inequity and justice within the context of how they're thinking through their response. We've seen 6 principles of what we would consider at this point a strong response based on the analysis that we've done and the interviews that we've done with business leaders and other thought leaders. There's 4 that are kind of specific to business response, and then there's 2 that are foundational. So let me speak first to those that are specific to business response. First and foremost, the need to protect employees, frontline workers, farmers, across that entire value chain. Those who earn the least are most at risk. And that is something that we kind of knew intuitively, all right? And some of us work more on than others. It again has shown that this is a big issue across the food system. The second would be ensuring that we build adaptability and flexibility into supply chains. And this is really challenging because supply chains are not designed for redundancy and risk. They're designed for just-in-time and planned delivery. So moving into how companies can more quickly adapt and build flexibility is important, while still considering the needs of the communities in which they're producing and from which they're sourcing key ingredients. It's critical that they take that into consideration as well. A third would be accelerating the producer and frontline focused response. We've spoken already about these high risk of SMEs and smallholders, and that has to be addressed through these business responses. And through that then is the 4th point of ensuring continuous cash flow across suppliers, across farming communities and suppliers, and into this frontline space that so many inhabit that really create consistency for the food system. And then responsibly supporting relief efforts. There is a need at times for relief to really be stepped up. We've seen that. I'm worried that we'll continue to see more of the need for that in the back half of the year, particularly for countries who are primarily food importers, but also for some of the communities that are hardest hit. And so ensuring that we're doing that in responsible ways with the types of foods that are coming in and the way we're structuring finance and support is going to be really important. And then these foundational aspects of how we do it collectively. No one company or one organization can do any of this on their own. So being really smart and fast in how we demonstrate collective leadership in building these partnerships and responses is going to be incredibly important. So with that, João, I'll pause. I know we'll move into more of this discussion, but hopefully that shines a bit of a light on where businesses is already responding and where we're seeing the strongest focus delivering the best outcomes in what is a really challenging environment.
Diane, thank you so much. You know, moving into like how to do it collectively, it's a really nice segue that you put. When we put a panel of, you know, experts like you, it's we bring a challenge, but then as the panel evolves, you all bring many more challenges to us. So let me share part of the challenge in seeking for a response, a systemic response to this, I will share this with Agnes now. Agnes, you are in charge of designing and leading one of the most important conferences next year, the UN Food Systems Summit. And we have heard a lot in this panel, lots of challenges, brought by COVID-19 pandemic and how it has evolved, and ideas for what needs to be contemplated in the recovery period. What is the red line in that conference, in the UN Food Systems Summit? What is the main question that you are trying to address? How do we move from there into the solution space of, how could this conference help improve the food system to produce food that is sustainable while improving food security, particularly in rural communities like in many developing countries? So how do we address all this in the UN Food Systems Summit? Over to you.
No, thank you. Listen, that's a lot of questions, but let me start by what Francesco said earlier and what Diane is alluding to. Even before COVID, our food system was broken. This summit was launched in October of last year. Even before we started, we were very much aware of what was going on from a COVID perspective. This was recognizing several things. That hunger has been increasing, at least in the part of the world where I live. Climate change is so real that we are reading from one drought to a flood, from a drought to a flood, but so is the rest of the world. The rest of the world is also experiencing these challenges. Our colleague from World Health Organization was very clear around our food and how it is impacting our health. Right now, the #1 cause of death is poor diets. Yesterday, someone was telling me that if food waste was a country, it would be the 3rd largest country after China and the US in terms of emissions. Our biodiversity loss is huge, it's so huge. You yourself said that the land over, equivalent to the size of South America is degraded already, and this goes with a lot of biodiversity. Food and how we produce food is causing over 80% of biodiversity loss. It's contributing 30% to emissions. So the challenges were huge already. But I want to mention 3 other challenges that happened as a result of COVID. One, we really had no idea. I mean, here from a developing world perspective, we did, but we really had no idea of the depth of vulnerabilities among us when it comes to food and how people access food. COVID has made that very clear. We had no idea of the level of fragility that exists in our systems with regards to how we access food, and the need then to just build more resilience. But also we undervalued or even underestimated, and this goes to the question again, the point that my colleague was making, that Francesco was making on Ebola. We really never understood until now the role of local action when it comes to some of these things and how it can impact a total global system. The COVID crisis has showed us that things that happen locally can actually do have a huge impact on all of us. So all this said, it goes back to one major thing, that our systems are extremely fragile, that there are huge numbers of people among us that we need to reach, that we need to engage all of us individually. So from a design perspective, one thing that I'm taking into consideration that I hadn't given significant thought until the COVID crisis, is just the fact that we need to reach not countries, not communities, we need to reach everybody with the discussion on our food systems and what needs to change within our food system. So our design now of our food system is taking into consideration that we need to reach every adult out there with what is at stake. So that's number one, and I'll talk to you about the design. So number two is we need to get real concrete political action. We need to get real concrete actions also with regards to how we can shift our food system. But in terms of design, let me tell you how we are going to reach 5 billion people. I keep talking about how we are going to reach 5 billion people, because if we are 7 billion people and 2 billion are children. I want to believe that 5 billion people are people we need to reach with a conversation on how we need to change our food system. We are going to be carrying out dialogues, not in one country, in every country, food systems dialogues. We are going to establish an online platform that allows us to reach as many people as possible. We have a whole, as you've seen, we have a whole expertise, group of experts that have been put together to gather all the science and evidence that can support us in this food system. And we have put in place tracks, action tracks. We are now talking about 5 action tracks that address all the areas that I talked to you about. And these action tracks would be looking to get concrete game-changing action, concrete political action that really would focus on the fact that unless we do things differently now, we are not going to achieve the SDGs. So I will not go to the list of the actions because they exactly mirror the challenges that I've talked about. But these actions, if we took them, would definitely take us to a new path of achieving SDGs. The Food System Summit's sole role is to ensure that we turn around. Right now, we're in the opposite direction of where the SDGs are going. We need to turn back. We need to look back towards the SDGs and start working at a pace that will get us there by 2030. So hopefully, with all these actions that we are putting together, with a global engagement of each one and every one of you, we have designed our champion system not to be about individual people. We have designed a network of champion systems so that you all can help us reach as deep as possible and bring in as many people as possible. So hopefully by designing a global campaign, if I might call it, a global movement, if I might call it, that helps us remember each time that each of us makes a decision to eat 3 times a day. If you're, of course, not excluding, I'm not talking about the people that have had choices to make, but rather the people that actually make choices, make 3 choices 3 times a day. And those choices impact our environment as well. They impact what we eat, they impact our body, but they impact our environment as well. So I'm getting to a place where I believe that if we pull off this campaign as we have planned it, we will get a turnaround in global action, but we will also use the very element Francesco said. This is not the time to just sit through a situation, because definitely what has happened in the last 10 years shows us that we have run out of time with regards to taking business as usual approach to our food systems.
Agnes, thank you so much. This is very, very inspiring what you're doing and the mission that you have ahead of you. There is one question that came from our audience that I'd like to pose to you is, what are the gender implications or the gender impacts of the COVID crisis? And is the conference UN Food System going to pay particular attention to gender issues? If you can reflect on that, say a few words.
So, I mean, when we talk about vulnerabilities, when we talk about the choices between how many meals you have to put on a table each day, when we talk about the choice of food you have to put on your table for children to eat, but also when we talk about how communities, huge communities now are cash-strapped, and in addition to that, they are locked up in these houses. I mean, we are seeing a lot of gender-based violence that is happening as a result of that. There's a lot that COVID has brought out as well. In fact, I was going to, when we come to the levers, discussing about the levers of change, I was going to say that gender, we must see the opportunity to move gender forward differently. We must see the opportunity to move youth and gender forward differently, because this is a huge group of people that whose capabilities and whose opportunities we have not exploited as much as we should. So yes, it's an area that we definitely see as a huge opportunity for the Food System Summit.
Agnes, thank you so much for these insights. What you're doing is amazing. So, you know, all the very best. Count on all of us to help you towards great accomplishments in the Food System Summit. Let me ask Francesco now. Francesco, Agnes mentioned the relationship of food and the SDGs. Do you think it's possible to advance the SDGs without achieving healthy, nutritious, and sustainable diets for everyone on the planet? And how do we ensure this is prioritized in the aftermath of the pandemic? Over to you, Francesco.
Yeah, João, first of all, I'd like to quote again what you said at the beginning of this seminar. The number of people with food insecurity will actually increase. The WFP estimates there's going to be 135 million more people who are going to be affected by food insecurity. And the pandemic has generated a negative impact on poverty. And we've estimated that simply based on that economic impact, there will be probably about 7 more million children with wasting on top of the 47 we have. So this means going back. This means backsliding from our progress in achieving the SDGs. So yeah, we cannot achieve the SDGs without a healthy and sustainable diets and safe diets for all. So nutrition is central to the achievement of the 2030 agenda. The SDG 2 particularly calls for the ending all forms of malnutrition. And we know that there's so many important interactions of good nutrition with overall development. And we can do that staying within the planetary boundaries. So what next? I think really the Food System Summit that Agnes is leading, is coordinating, is critical at this stage. Because the pandemic is, at least is teaching us an important lesson. And we now have, I think, greater awareness of the interconnections of the world, whether it's geographic, economic, commercial. The COVID-19 is a zoonosis. So it's something that is being generated by a dysfunctional food system. So at least we have that awareness. And that awareness has led to an incredible political response in many places. And UN Secretary General has produced a very important brief with a number of recommendations. The Committee of Food Security is involved in the response. The G20 agricultural ministers have made a commitment to work together to help ensure that sufficient, safe, affordable, and nutritious food continues to be available and accessible to all people, including the poorest, the most vulnerable and displaced people, in a timely, safe, and organized manner, consistent with national nutrition requirement. So those are very important statements. We have all those statements. We're in the middle of the UN Decade of Action on Nutrition, and still we haven't seen enough progress. But that awareness will make things change. Now, how to change? Well, that's why we need the Food System Summit. But we also have to build on the investment, because the response has been, well, even if we have a big crisis, let's be counter-cyclical and make investment. But then now we need to build back better. So we should avoid the business as usual scenarios. And we definitely need to ensure that we undertake coherent and innovative policies for actions covering the entire food system to ensure access to sustainable, healthy diets for all and reduce food and nutrient loss and waste. Countries also need to consider food safety, and they need to use a One Health approach. So recognizing that human health, animal health, and the environment are interconnected, can tackle infectious diseases such as zoonosis, but also involves domestic, animal, and wildlife health, food safety, human health. So all in the same space. And that would be the only way to make again progress and to quickly recover the ground that we've lost.
Amazing, Francesco, thank you so much. It's really nice. You mentioned climate change in your response, and one of the questions that the audience that came from the audience now that I think it's directed to you, Paul. We know that climate change poses threats to our ability to produce food, but how does climate change affect the nutritional quality of our food? Does it affect it?
Most likely, yes. We know that the nutritional content of certain plant food is being affected. I mean, the level of CO2 itself is being is creating this effect. And of course, the food insecurity in some parts of the world I'm just thinking, for example, of the small island development states who are not able to any longer to produce their food, and they will rely more and more on import and trade. So all this we know. We also need to be aware that it goes both ways. So, the climate change is affecting food insecurity, but also the way we eat unsustainably is responsible for some of those effects. And that's where we can take action ourselves, and more radically, we can shift our diets and consumption patterns to eat diets which are more compatible with the planetary boundaries. When we can actually make agriculture into a solution to the climate problem, rather than at the moment, the greenhouse gases produced by the food system are about a third, and not very much has been happening. They could actually be absorbing CO2. And then we have the issue of the use of water, the issue of the use of land, and the impact of the use of nitrogen synthetic fertilizer to be able to produce the food we eat. We can do much more to stay within those planetary boundaries if we change our diet, and if the governments put in place adequate policies to support those healthy and sustainable choices.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Francesco. In fact, there are quite a number of countries that are interested to take another look at their national dietary guidelines, so that they will increase the quality of human health and reduce the environmental impacts. This is a new line of research that a few organizations are doing, and it's totally aligned with some countries that we have seen. So I could not agree more with you. Diane, let's go to you now, because we have heard throughout the seminar about disruptions in nutritional, disruptions in services, transport, bottlenecks, job losses, and so on. So what policy lessons have we learned for addressing future food system disruptions in the aftermath of COVID?
Thank you so much again for these good questions, and the way you draw links across what we're all saying. I think it's really makes it even more enriching. So like I said, we have been monitoring policy response to the COVID pandemic, and we've seen lots of different ways that governments are addressing bottlenecks. So we've heard examples already, like exempting agricultural and food activities from lockdowns and adjusting certain production activities, helping facilitate trade. One important response was governments were providing information about what was happening in food markets, so that there would be a dampening effect on panic buying, which is another way that it facilitates markets actually getting food to, or products to people who need them. And the OECD has an annual flagship publication, which is backward looking, that looks at how governments actually spend in agriculture, which I think is a really important part of this, this whole debate and thinking about going forward, because having a backward look at what the spending has been can help help you see why sometimes change is so difficult. Because we will have, based on certain patterns of spending, certain kinds of interests who might be less interested in changing. So in our most recent monitoring and evaluation report, which was launched last week, we had two parts to it. One was kind of the traditional part, which is backward-looking summary of support in agriculture. And what the team that was working on that found was that the total support to agriculture exceeds $700 billion per year. And we know that lots of that support can be used in positive initiatives, which could help, that can help agriculture be resilient in the face of climate, and also help a transition to a more sustainable agriculture. But in fact, lots of the policies that we observe traditionally are focusing on payments or areas that actually make the system less resilient. And so we have this backward look that is evaluating the spending up until the end of 2019. And then we also have in that report some discussion of how countries were deciding to move resources into agriculture and what they could do. And what we saw was that there were sort of three basic principles around the spending that helped this kind of moving resources into agriculture be more, promote agriculture to be more resilient. One is efforts that policymakers took to make sure that markets were open and transparent and predictable made a big difference, because it helps with both the firms making decisions, but it also helps consumers in understanding where they can have access and what the parameters are. The second thing is many governments put in place social safety nets, and this is clearly important. Many of the speakers already have talked about it, but we saw some efforts, for example, collaborations between the public and private sector to make sure that food was moving towards vulnerable populations. And then the third principle, which I think maybe is particularly important to point out in the context of this discussion, and as we think about getting prepared for next year's Food Systems Summit, is it could be a great moment to think about repurposing the support that has already traditionally been provided over the years to agriculture, and think about how to shift some of those resources in ways that are going to make the sector more resilient, productive, and sustainable. And so those kinds of investments, and maybe Suzanne will talk about this in more detail, but they would relate, for example, to investments to promote innovation, investments in research and development, the kinds of things that allow the sector to move in new directions. And then if I can just say one more thing, because some of Agnes's comments was making me think about change and what helps us make change. Another part of the work that we do is looking at exactly this, how to have coherent policies through food systems and what kinds of things create stickiness and change. And we sort of frame the discussion around the fact that there's sort of three key aspects of how people think about change and policies. One is facts. You know, you need good information, you need accurate information, and you need people to have access to it. The second is interests. So different interests will be vested in a particular outcome. And the third is values. And the value piece of it, to me, I could hear when Agnes was talking, I could hear when Francesco was talking. This is a really critical thing to be thinking about as we think about where the levers are to actually get real sustainable change. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you so much, Diane. I love how you finished it. Access to information, interests, and value. And this is super, a very, very powerful message. And let's talk about the interests then. To Suzanne, what are the interests of, you know, the financial sector in all this? What are the stakes? You mentioned before that the food sector is risky business for the financial sector. And Agnes said that, you know, part of this is the role of small and medium enterprises. So, you know, how do you see the major investment opportunities, and what are the hurdles so that we need to overcome to make these SMEs and, you know, the food sector less risky to investment?
Thank you. I mean, so many interesting topics have been brought up, and I think that there's a confluence that is coming together. And one thing that is very clear is that people are starting to evaluate how you do things from many different aspects in a different way given this current environment. You know, as many of the things that we've heard already saying, you know, we can't do the same old because we know that the risks are out there. And so if you quantify that or put that into the context of financial risk, you know, there has been movements lately, you know, that have been taking on board. Climate change is a very real risk within the agricultural sector. You know, I know many companies who are putting in specific climate mitigation approaches and policies that they need to take into consideration when they're putting together their operational plans. So I think that climate change affects how you look at risk. I think that the water risk is there. You see from a finance perspective, you see, you know, what you would call environmental social governance risk. Many of the rating agencies are now factoring in these kinds of aspects. And if you haven't taken those into consideration, well, you know, your rating, if you are rated at that aspect, then you need to address those issues. But getting back down to the whole issue of SMEs, where we know most of the employment and the food production comes from globally, we know that that those demands will increase with time. You know, some of the statistics that you read about saying that, you know, the demand for food will need to increase by 70% by 2050. Those are huge numbers which require, you know, $80 billion of annual investments to meet. So how do you match that? And I think that you need to look in this current environment. You know, we mentioned about risk and also about collective leadership. I think that some of the things that I've been seeing is that where you have this public-private partnerships, you see a lot more of that. I think that through that innovation comes, I think through that you have what, you know, we will call blended finance solutions, so that you can actually have, you know, the public sector facilitating the private sector to take on those risks and look at new solutions to providing finance in those. So I think that there's many opportunities to provide that, and I would call that innovative finance. I would call that, you know, looking for solutions in that. One of the things that we haven't really talked about yet is about technology. We did a little bit, but I think that technology from a de-risking point of view is an opportunity. And through that, then you can provide different, you know, finance solutions. You can de-risk things. You hear about in agricultural technology the use of satellite technology to help predict whether climate change is going to impact certain crops during certain times. So I think all of these things come together where you have new instruments, you have new insurance solutions that I think is important for this. You have the ability, as I've mentioned before, about trade finance. I think you really do need to keep those wheels greased, those economic wheels internationally and locally in particular. So through that, and you know, we've all heard about green bonds and that kind of stuff. There's different financial solutions that you can use. Why don't we think about agricultural bonds, you know, in that same context? So I think that this is an opportunity for innovation. I think that, you know, with increased use of the information and facts and data that we have, we should be able to come up with these solutions. But I do think that it's also an opportunity, as I mentioned, to look at the public-private partnerships and see how you can leverage one another, because we all recognize, I think, that we need to leverage the private sector within this to help provide the solutions to that, and then addressing those risks accordingly. So I think that with this, innovative finance, I think, is something that we need to focus on, and the solutions that are provided through that.
Suzanne, thank you very much. There's one question coming from the audience that I think is particularly interesting here. We have Leanne before, she mentioned, you know, how agri-food supports, like including subsidies and so on, you know, we need to repurpose them so they begin to generate public goods instead of only private benefits. So here the question that comes from the audience is, are there things that need to happen in the financial system so that we move away from unsustainable intensification towards resilient agriculture from the financial side?
No, thank you for that. I think that I had, as I was making some notes here, I have, you know, climate resilient solutions. I've actually agricultural resilient solutions. I think that we need to think already beyond where we are now and what kind of resilient solutions that we can develop. And I think that, yes, refocusing where you can have the highest impact, where you know, where you see the biggest need, and where you can have the biggest impact. I think that focusing on resilient agriculture, and that actually does we need to take into consideration the climate impacts of all of this, because we know that water risk is one of the biggest risks globally from the agricultural space. And also, do we always need to have products that, or agricultural products that are huge water consumers. So you need to think in solutions as to, you know, maybe there's different intercropping ways that you can help finance. And as a financier, you know, when you're looking at the sustainability of the financing that you're providing, as well as the overall environmental risk that you're looking at, you need to look at these solutions that to create a sustainable, and which will include resilience going forward. Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. Let's move now to Diane. Diane, with all that we have heard, you know, economies, jobs were lost, economies, governments lost a lot of money in tax revenues. Businesses have lost a lot of money in their own revenues and profits. Now, but there is a concern that as we recover, there will be pervasive rent-seeking behavior, and there is a concern that businesses could be willing to make their profits back too quickly. So how do we ensure that sustainability is at the forefront of the minds of the private sector? Can you help us understand that, please?
João, I think this gets to a really critical point about how we think about recovery from COVID to build a better and more resilient future, and not simply slide back to where we were, or worse, reverse even further, which is only some of the risks that Francesco was pointing out. So how to do that? There's got to be a real focus on accountability and recognition for leaders who in the business sector have been already quite thoughtful in how they've responded to this. And these strong principles of response that we've pointed out, there are companies who already have shown through their responses what that can look like to build back better. And we need to emphasize those. There are companies who've made a point of not letting go any of their employees and repurposing that work. There are companies who have had to furlough but have ensured safety nets for those workers. There's already companies who have thought through what types of portfolio offerings need to be available and how they source those with SME support. So recognition for that performance is critical. We need to shine a light on that and ensure that there's consumer awareness, consumers reward those who they know do well. But there is also a financial market responsibility. And I'd like to build on what Suzanne was saying, and Leanne, you touched on this as well. There should be recognition in the factors of performance assessment by shareholders of companies that are doing really the best in their responses. You know, Agnes, I think you were the one who talked about how do we look towards internalizing these externalities of social performance and environmental performance as we think about contributions leading into game changers for the Food Systems Summit. How do we think about this and bring this COVID lens to it as well? So there's an aspect of how we reward and recognize, but also one of the very powerful aspects that we have available to us is as governments begin to think through their recovery packages, what sort of incentives they put in place for the private sector in their responses. We've seen some really innovative thinking coming out of what the EU has been considering. And this builds a bit on what Leanne was saying relative to trade and trade incentives and how those should be reconsidered, COVID recovery packages and economic stimulus. We've seen France put expectations on its logistics companies for decarbonization to have access to recovery funds. And these types of indicators by government speaking to this build of how private and public sector can create incentives and partnerships for and with each other, it's going to be particularly important because while some businesses will undoubtedly and have already started to lead in their response, we know that there are going to be others who will need government incentive to ensure that we are actually building back better in the light of what COVID has shown us are the most fragile aspects of our systems.
Very good. Thank you so much for these reflections, Diane. Diane, if I may, what are the, going into the third aspect of the questions here, what are the main levers that you think we need to approach to deliver sustainability, enhance productivity and resilience of the food system? What are the levers? Who are the players that businesses need to activate, and how could these players help? Let's start with you.
I'm happy to start with that. It's a big space.
It is.
And to the power of partnership and mutual accountability. So there's a real aspect of what sort of expectations and packages the governments are putting into place and how they look towards business for business recovery aid packages. But what I'll also share is in the interviews and the discussions that we've been having, we've seen some real key themes beginning to emerge from both what we've seen from a rapid response requirement, and as we think about what this blueprint for recovery needs to look like to ensure that we're getting after what we need to for business recovery, the SDGs, and more resilient societies and a better food system. This issue of inclusion that we've touched on is going to be key. So thinking about collective action that enables better inclusion. We've spoken already about the need for resilience and sustainability. So how we start to factor those externalities into financial reporting and financial performance, I think is going to be really, really important. There should be better public-private partnership as we think about rural development and landscapes development. We can think about supply chains very differently when they're no longer linear to a single ingredient or crop and more to productive landscapes. There's been a lot of discussion already, but I want to reinforce it again. How we think about trade sustainability is going to be really important. And then there is an increasing theme through all of this that is coming out around digitalization and the role of technology. Some of the most successful conversions we saw when COVID lockdown occurred for farmers getting access to the markets for their crops was in places where all of a sudden e-commerce started to pop up, connecting farmers to consumers who were locked in their homes. And all of a sudden creating these direct digital interactions was fascinating. We saw it from rural communities in Africa to rural communities in Brazil to rural communities in the US. These opportunities started to proliferate without really a guided effort. As we think about learning from that, using digitalization for everything from transparency and traceability to market engagement and consumer direct engagement, we're gonna see some really fascinating opportunities that can be accelerators. And I want to emphasize the need for these focus areas to focus on those that will accelerate. As we think about these action tracks that Agnes spoke to, they're going to be so important for creating momentum to and through the Food System Summit. Those that can accelerate this transformation using technology, using digitalization, using it, different forms of community engagement are the ones that are going to excite business, ones that are going to excite consumers, and ones that are going to really excite those at the community level and the government level who want to create the right types of investment opportunities.
Very good. That's quite insightful. Thank you so much. And I'll use the last part. Actually, I'll use the last part about creating investment opportunities, and I will go to Suzanne. And then another idea that you gave me, it's about trade sustainability that you mentioned. And in the sequence, I'll go to Leanne to talk about trade sustainability. So thank you very much, Diane. So Suzanne, how can we make this, what are the levers in terms of the financial incentives? Who are the players? How could we help?
Well, I think that this situation has focused opportunities both at the local community, the local regional, the local country levels, as well as the international space. We know that the COVID environment and the disruption of the supply chains has created, one is disruption, but two, opportunities. And some of the things that Diane was saying is that I've been amazed at how, on even in my little space here, I'm in Canada, and all of a sudden you have all the local farmers which are reaching out to the local community to supply, to create supply demands, because this whole disruption of supply chains has had a huge impact. There used to be providing huge supplies to restaurants and industrial type of supply receivers. And that has changed. So it requires innovation. It requires people to think outside the box a little bit and think, what are the investment opportunities here? I think that, I'm hoping that the resilience part in building the next phase, looking beyond COVID, will create new partnerships and investment opportunities. Some of the things that we've talked about here is investment opportunities where you need to provide digitization. I think with that, then you have also, drought resistance type of seed opportunities, for example, fertilizers where you need to provide the inputs and stuff to farmers. So there's ways of finding new platforms to connect this. And I also believe that you need to have local banks that are involved in this within the local community and encourage them to take those risks. And I will say, I've talked to many people, I've talked to insurance companies and stuff, and again, the agricultural space generally along the value chain from farm to fork is considered a relatively risky. That I think that shining the light on that and actually the information, what exactly is the risk there and how you can quantify that and how you can actually provide new de-risking solutions to that. I think we're moving in that direction, but I think that you're going to have different financial solutions at the different levels within the different parties that are the recipients of this. So I think that, there's many things that we can look at. I'm just looking at some of my notes here, some of the things that I wrote down. Leveraging electronic payment platforms is something that you can really use at the local level and internationally as well. But you need to also have those public-private partnerships in order to facilitate that. Because we know that the private sector is not willing to take on a lot of those risks. So I think that there are opportunities there to do that and to understand that. I have seen a level of engagement within the international finance community and the business community that I hadn't seen before. So I think that that is very encouraging. And I think through those ongoing discussions from the short term, the medium, and the long term, you can come up with different solutions for addressing different needs and stuff. And that's a very wide-ranging, answer. I do understand, but at the same time, I think if you can quantify the risk, then you can actually provide financial solutions to those particular risks, and they may differ in the different markets.
Thank you, Suzanne. Very insightful. Let me ask now for Leanne to reflect on the levers. If you could specifically focus, Leanne, because this would address a question that came from the audience about trade sustainability that Diane mentioned in light of climate change. How can we use trade to mitigate climate change? Over to you, Leanne.
That's a great question. I had gone in my head sort of in another direction, but
you can go to.
So starting with the question that I guess came in from the audience, I mean, in a well-functioning trading system, you can move products from where they're produced to where they're needed. And so the question is, what are the elements of a well-functioning trading system? And of course, this relates to climate change, because we know with climate change, we're likely to have more variability in production and more risks, like Suzanne has talked about, related to water, for example. And so in terms of the elements around a well-functioning trading system, I mean, the key thing, and it probably is stating the obvious, is you need the multilateral trading system to work. You want the trading system to be rules-based and transparent so that all the actors in the food system can see the information they need to engage. For example, firms who are looking for opportunities, they can have the information that they need, and they have predictable access to markets so they can move their products there. And another element is potentially looking at ways that parts of regulations or other types of measures that governments introduce could be harmonized to remove some of the stickiness or friction that happens when, for example, different regulations diverge, but there's no really underlying, they diverge just organically. So you could think about what are the situations where some kind of harmonization would actually help the trading system work better. And maybe just that sometimes there's an implicit question inside these questions about trade sustainability. So in the moment of COVID, there were some voices that were saying, in fact, what we need to do is shorten supply chains. And in fact, that perspective, I believe, ignores the way that trade actually can diffuse risks. So the better the trading system is working, the more options firms have to move their products flexibly, depending on where the shocks come in. When you start thinking about restricting those choices by making decisions about where products are coming from and what needs to be limited, the harder it is for the trading system to be resilient and to actually be contributing to positive outcomes when there's this kind of a disruptive shock.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Diane. Actually, you answered a question from the audience about local versus global supply chain. So thank you very much. That's answered. Francesco, let's go to you for the levers, if you will, please.
Yeah, I think we have a number of opportunities, but clearly governments will need to continue playing a central role to build and maintain sustainable food systems. So there are certain policies that require revision. Agricultural subsidies, that needs to be reviewed, they need to be reoriented to keep them away from certain practices and then using them to incentivize the production of sustainable, safe, healthy, and nutritious food. Then still in the public domain, certain policies that might strengthen the localization, regionalization of food systems, and we've seen the value of short supply chains, and that can be reinforced. Sustainable local economies, protect livelihoods and cultural tradition. That's all important. And then better governance with accountability, transparency, inclusive mechanism at all levels. But then what I heard also in the conversation today is important role of business. Business that could start measuring success in a different way, as remeasuring agricultural productivity, considering sustainability as a global good. But also we would need to really measure the true cost of food. So we need new metrics, a new system to measure the cost of food, including the externalities. That would also change the way we consume food. But I was really pleased to hear Suzanne talking about innovative financing, and Diane talking about how business is going to be influenced by the new investment environment, and that is an incredible opportunities. But we also need to make sure that public and private investment are aligned and synergistic, and public support for research, for example, that could be directly to the improvement of the diet. So that is in terms of what different constituencies can do. But we also need to leverage on the multiple groups that are working towards the same goal, and really work across sector, across the agriculture, food, and environment sector. That kind of intersectoral collaboration is going to be the way we achieve our goals.
Very good. Thank you so much, Francesco, for these insights. Agnes, I left you last on purpose. You and I have been about the levers from 4 sectors now: the health sector, the trade sector, finance, and businesses. Now, from where you stand, what are the levers for change? And with your comments, we will wrap up this session, this incredible session. So over to you, Agnes.
No, thank you. So I'll try not to repeat what others have said because a lot of information has come out. But I really wanted to underscore one word, leadership, and I'm going to base my levers on leadership. So given what we've learned in this COVID crisis, given what we've seen around the vulnerabilities and resilience that is needed, I've really come to the conclusion, and I know you all agree, whether it is food stamps, whether it is cash transfers, whether it is any other way of feeding people, it's just not right. We need to address what the problems are. We need to address the underlying causes of why these people can't feed themselves, and to acquire leadership, to invest in knowing these people, invest in data, invest in understanding how we can actually invest for the most vulnerable among us. And this is possible. There are so many examples in the world where people have invested in the most vulnerable and it has worked. So that's number one. So coming up with the policies, the policy environment that allows these investments to happen. It will require bold action. It will require bold action, whether it's in the public sector, like I just said, and in the businesses like Diane and others we are saying. And this would be looking at how we invest for people, like I just said, how we invest for environment, because we've run out of time. We really need to think about investing versus the environment, and of course, the value of action now. But it also requires managing trade-offs. Many of the things you've talked about will have a lot of trade-offs with regards to how investments are going to be done. It will need it will need great leadership from our countries to be able to manage these trade-offs in a manner that takes us forward. The next thing that I wanted to underscore, which has already been said, is the role of innovation. Innovation is going to be critical because we must come up with new ways of doing business. We must come up with game changers that are going to put us on a new trajectory with regards to what we need to do differently. And it's true that every time we stress test ourselves, we actually come up with great ideas. So the last bit is financing. And financing has been said. The reason I'm bringing it up is there's need to change. There's need to fund this change in discourse in our food systems. We are talking about so many things. These things will need funding if we are going to go back on track with regards to SDGs, but also if we need to change discourse, to change the way we are doing business. It will require funding from private sector, it will require funding from public sector. So it will require partnerships as well. It will require value, it will require individual commitments from each of us. Just like you said that we are moving towards concluding, I just wanted to leave this with you. One of the things I feel proud about when I see where our world has come from and where our world is that I know, I do it and I know each of you does it. Every time you're moving out of a hotel room, you switch off the lights. You think twice about, is the water running or what? We need to move to that with regards to our food and how our food systems work for us. Each of us needs to worry about the impact we are having on our world. Think about it. The Arctic recorded 38 degrees this year. That's not a world that we want to live in. That's not a world that we can actually live in because it's not going to allow us to live in it. So really, we have run out of time and we need everybody, we need consumers to change their behavior, we need businesses to be responsive, we need governments to take responsibility, and we need leadership. Thank you.
Agnes, thank you. You had, what you said are really the closing remarks for this workshop. Thank you so much. I just want to leave everyone, and leave the seminar with one thought. It's from a book that I was reading the other day. It said, you don't raise to the level of your goals, but you fall to the level of your systems. That means if the system is good, it will take you where you want to be. If it's not, we need to fix it so we'll reach our goals. And this is where the food system is. It gives us the opportunity to seek solutions and drive us towards the goals that we aim to achieve. With these words, I cannot be happier with your presence in this panel, the 6 panelists, and with our audience. Thank you so much for everything you did. You collaborated a lot. with WWF, OECD, EDF, and the World Bank. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.